Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of HDT Talks Trucking. I'm Jack Roberts, I'm Executive Editor. A few weeks ago we published a written story on the Trucking Info website on total cost of ownership, TCO. And one of the stars of that piece was Brian Antonellis. He's Senior Vice President, Fleet Operations at Fleet Advantage. And the story was so popular online, we thought we'd do a little video segment to sort of amplify some of the things Brian and I talked about in that story. So, Brian, how you doing today, man?
Doing wonderful. Yourself?
I'm doing great. So, as I have mentioned I'm not a financial expert. I'm not good at sort of calculating costs and all that. And so when I approached you guys to talk about TCO, I was sort of coming at it from that angle. You know, to me, it seems like such a complex, constantly moving target. That's the name of the written story online. It's a moving target because, as you told me, things are always kind of moving and changing and, constantly in motion. So let's kind of start from there. I know you've talked a little. One of the things I found most interesting in our interview was that you said typically small fleet guys have a really good handle on it because they understand their operating costs on a granular level. The big fleets also do well because they have the resources and the money to hire people and systems. It's sort of the middle fleets that really kind of lose that granular ability to know what's going on. You really feel like that's kind of the case for a lot of fleets?
Yeah, I do think about it. If you're a, 1 to 10 truck trucking company and you're the person paying the fuel expense for that month and you understand exactly what went into each truck and you can watch as they age and you start putting more money into those trucks, it's easy for you to see because you're writing the check, right? As you start to scale from 1 truck to 5 trucks to 10 trucks, and you move into that space of a small trucking company, 25 to 50, all of a sudden it's harder to do that on pen and paper. It's hard to say, well, how much did I spend? What truck did this go in? No, you're just getting one consolidated invoice. Your repairs aren't coming back as a single repair for 1 truck. They're coming back as, well, we sent 5 trucks over this month. And all of a sudden it becomes, just a monthly cost. And you get away from understanding exactly what's going into each truck.
So the other thing that I found interesting is there's no set formula for this. Every fleet, the metrics are different, the applications are different, the vehicles are different, the engine. We could just go down the list. So I think for me, one of the interesting challenges is you kind of have to come up with your own recipe for this gumbo, don't you?
You do. You have to see how your truck is performing where it's in the application it's running in, right? And you just hit on it by having different OEMs, different engine combinations, maybe different axle weights to pull different types of material. But having a platform where you can understand a couple of basic costs that are coming in. You want to understand the mileage of the equipment that you're using, right? Because going back to a cost per mile is at least a standard. You want to understand the costs and how they're affected by OEM or engine type. So you should break it up to say, my Volvos are performing at a 8 mile per gallon. My Freightliners are performing at an 8.2 mile per gallon. And how many miles are they running? So how are they performing in a cost per mile? So you want to break it up, but you want to understand fuel cost. You want to understand gallons, miles, and then how they're affected by different OEMs on the fuel side. And then on the maintenance side, you still want to have those breakdowns because not each OEM runs at the same cost per mile, right? But you want to understand your maintenance cost by VRMS code, right? So you want to be able to understand where am I spending my money, on what asset am I spending my money, and what component are you focusing, right? So you want to know how many tires are you putting on the truck? What are you spending on brakes? What are you spending on your transmissions, your engines, your cooling system, your cabs, all those individual codes. And you want to do that because you want to understand the current economics of each truck by OEM, by engine type. And what you want to do is follow that progression throughout its life cycle. So you want to follow how much does it cost me to run a 1-year-old truck, a 2-year-old truck, a 3-year-old truck, 4-year-old truck. Because what are you doing? You're starting to build a case around how you look at your TCO. So if I know that and listen, I'm not saying any individual OEM here is better than any other. We're we're agnostic here. But you want to understand that in your application, at what time in its life do we start to see fuel degradation? At what time in its life do we start to see the repair and maintenance costs go higher? And if you can chart that out, you can really look at, listen, this truck in year one cost me, 7 cents a mile to run. Year two cost me 12 cents a mile, 14 cents a mile, 16 cents a mile. When you can understand those individual costs, you can also start looking at the cost of new equipment, and you can really find that sweet spot where it makes more sense to replace a piece of equipment than to continue to put money into it.
Right. That was the other interesting thing. It's not just about understanding your costs, it's understanding when the costs get prohibitive and it's time to, like you said, dispose of equipment and get something new. And part of that was fuel degradation, which I found to be really interesting and didn't know a lot about. Talk a little bit about what fuel degradation is and why it's important to a fleet manager.
Sure. So really what you need to understand is the improvements in fuel economy that happen year over year. So today, if you have a 1-year-old truck, the new truck is probably getting somewhere between 1.8 and 2% better fuel economy. We have technology that continues to improve, and we have the GHG mandates that have pushed engine manufacturers and OEMs to get better each year. So if the industry is getting 2% better each year, every year your truck is older, you've lost about that 2%, right, per year. And then when you hit about 400 to 450,000 miles, if you were getting 8 miles per gallon throughout its first 4 years, when you go into that 400 to 500,000 miles, you'll start to see your fuel economy drop a little bit. It'll go down to 7.9, 7.8, 7.7. So what's really happened over the life cycle of that truck? Every year, new equipment is getting 2% better. So you may have a compound annual growth rate of 8% over those 4 years. But you've also had a loss in your current fuel economy of 2, 3, 4 tenths per mile. And all of a sudden, now you have this gap between what a new piece of equipment would perform from an MPG and cost standpoint and what your older asset's performing at. And that gap happens not only on the fuel side, it happens on the R&M side, right? We talked before about that natural curve of R&M where you start off around 2 or 3 cents per mile in year one, year two. And then by the time you get to year 5, you're up around somewhere between, historically it was 10 to 12 cents. But with the addition of emission systems, we start to see that jump dramatically when you get up to that 4 or 500,000 mile mark. So all of a sudden it can jump up to 15, 17 cents a mile. And what you're really watching is, hey, my fuel economy is going to get better every year. So if I had a new truck, it would save me some money. After 4 or 5 years, we'll be about 8% better. We'll have a little bit of fuel degradation, but then we'll also have our R&M costs that have gone from 2 cents a mile up to somewhere between 12 and 15 cents a mile. And watching all those shifting economics of your current fleet is really important because you know the fixed cost of a new piece of equipment. So if we can watch that shifting economics of your current fleet, you'll know exactly when you should replace a truck to make sure that you don't pay any more than you need to. You can get into a new piece of equipment and your total cost of ownership will be at the same point or lower than your current piece of equipment's running. And it really drives us into a very open capital cycle. So, I mean, historically, people have thought about capital acquisition. You get approval sometime mid-year, you move into Q3, Q4, you do your specs, and you get ready to buy for the next year. And then you're replacing. That's a great time to go ahead and look at your total cost of ownership of your current fleet and compare it versus a new truck. But fleets that are really good at it, they don't look at it as a 1-year cycle. We can actually get it down to the quarter or the month when you should be replacing that piece of equipment so that you're not paying anymore, right? As soon as it makes more sense to replace than to pay for your existing piece of equipment, why wouldn't you do it?
Time is money, and that's why CatScale built the Weigh My Truck app. Your drivers can complete their entire weigh without ever leaving the cab. They'll see their weights on their mobile device or tablet, and scale tickets can be automatically emailed to you. With a fleet profile, you can save back office time as well. No driver reimbursements. And you'll have access to report data. Find out more at weighmytruck.com.
Right?
But it's not that simple, though, is it? Because then you have to flip the coin over and you have to start looking at what are the interest rates like right now? What's inflation doing? financing. Again, everything in the TCO equation to me is like a moving target and metric. So even though you have determined that it's probably time to get rid of this truck, you still have to do a little work, don't you?
You do. So, we just talked about the front end, understanding the economics of your current truck, but you make a great point, understanding the cost of a new piece of equipment. So whether it's, you're going to lease, you're going to purchase, whatever you're going to do, you need to be working to get your quotes for the new piece of equipment. How much did it go up model year over model year? What's your financial structure that you're going to utilize? And then you have to put that financial portion and compare it to the economics of your current truck that you're running now, right? And when you can do that, and that's why I say it gets lost in those mid-size fleets. So a small fleet, you're paying each of those individual bills. You probably have a ledger that you're keeping that says, here's how much this truck is costing me. You're going to your dealer. It's fairly easy to keep your arms wrapped around it, right? So they're going to do a pretty good job at it. But as you move into that, small to medium sized fleet where you get, a few hundred trucks up to 500 or 600 trucks, you may not have the internal infrastructure to have an analytics team to do all that work for you. You may not have invested into a maintenance software system, or everybody has an ELD of some sort they're running now by mandate, but it's harder to get your data. So those size fleets, there's a lot of value in them going back and looking at exactly what they're doing before they mature into a large fleet where they can invest in those analytics teams and the different support equipment you're going to need to sort of navigate your TCO.
One thing that I find interesting about TCO, we're sort of talking best case scenarios right now. We're just tracking costs, but TCO can help you figure out when something isn't working for you. And maybe you need to change a spec, or maybe you need to change, brand of tire, or the type of tire. Talk a little bit about how that can works and how that can help fleets.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, so we talked at the beginning about making sure you broke down the cost by OEM and by engine type, by transmission type. Absolutely. So you'll see a dramatic shift, whether you run an 11 liter, a 13 liter, a 15 liter. If you can break down the cost by those groupings, you can get down to saying, hey, in my application on an 11 liter, I'm running, 7.5 miles per gallon. With my 13 liter, I'm running 7.4. With my 15 liter, I'm running 8 miles per gallon. Sometimes it goes against the normal convention of understanding, because what you're trying to understand is how that truck is being used, how that engine is adapting to the work you're trying to have it do. And sometimes to run a smaller engine doesn't mean you're going to get better fuel economy. To run a larger engine, sometimes you don't need it. But when you can break it down and then go back and look into your specs and say, what can I change? I think about TCO from an asset perspective a lot of times, but when you think about it from a spec side of it, it's not just the piece of equipment, it's how it's utilized. So are you running it up north? Are you running it in cold weather? Are you running it, and how do those different attributes of how the truck is used affect your TCO as well? So, absolutely. It's exciting to know when the economic tipping point happens, but if you can go back to the VMRS code level and watch the natural progression of that truck age, understand where you're spending the money, what components are either wearing out prematurely, or could you possibly extend your warranty? Could you change your brand of tire? What can we do to try to make sure that you're spending the least amount of money as that truck goes through its life cycle? And it really is just a continuous improvement process. Hopefully each year your spec is a little bit better because your data is driving you towards some sort of change. One of the things that we've seen over probably the last 5 years or 7 years as we've moved into almost all automated transmissions is the reliance on a really high rear axle ratio. It's sort of gone away. You think back to where we were 10 or 15 years ago, to see a 328 rear axle ratio was sort of the norm. Now you're looking at, because of the way you program the automated transmission, we've been able to lower our rear axle ratios into the, sometimes down to the 260s, 240s. And when you can do that, we're seeing significant savings in fuel, but it's really about understanding exactly how much fuel each truck is burning, having a strategic approach to how you're going to buy your equipment, and then making some educated guesses in trying equipment in small quantities.
That was my next question. Kind of the next step. Let's say you think you need to try a different rear axle, or you need to try a different engine. Would you carve a truck out and apply the same TCO metrics to it as your standard vehicle, and then at the end of a quarter compare and see where you stand? How does that process work?
Yeah, you want to make sure you have the sample size right, and you don't want to put it in an outlier location. I always think of everything in the US as I-80 North or I-80 South, right? So you don't want to put your one test unit in Minnesota or Chicago to face a very hard winter and then try to compare it versus a majority of your fleet running down south. So you want to figure out what the right sample size is. If the data is driving you towards making a change, let's put a handful of trucks in the right locations so we can get a good sample size and absolutely compare it to your current TCO in the majority of your trucks so that you can say, hey, look, we made this change. We moved to a 264 rear axle ratio away from a 287. And what we saw was an improvement from 7.5 to 7.7 miles per gallon. So we can identify that, that specific change drove some productivity for us there. What you got to be careful about is, the data will tell you a lot of things. And you don't want to start going and testing everywhere. You don't want to start changing multiple components every year, because you're going to lose track of, were there really value in the changes that you made, or was it just simply if you put enough data points on there, it'll make you think a little bit differently. So no, absolutely. I mean, that's where I find the fleet leadership, and you can get drivers involved, where you can say, hey, here's what the data is telling us, here's the changes we think we can make, here's how it's driving it. You can even go into it from a safety perspective, where are there different safety components that we can put on there? Are there different, driver interactions that you can put on there? And if you build out your TCO model, I think about it simplistically from a fuel, R&M, but as you start to build that out and you start to say, how does it affect safety? Well, if your newer trucks have those driver interactions, the warnings, the buzzers, the lane departures, the collision avoidance, and you're watching TCO and you put your safety cost, your insurance cost factored into that, you can see, where those changes are affecting it. And a lot of times what that'll help with is, if you want to go ahead and add safety equipment to your vehicle, and maybe your leadership is saying, I don't want to pay $10,000 more for that truck. Not, but when I put it into my TCO model, I can see that, yes, I'm making an initial investment, and on the back end, I'm saving $30,000 per unit from crashes, driver satisfaction, turnover, all those soft costs that are sometimes hard to calculate, but you can go through that work and make sure that you're understanding exactly what goes into the value of those additional specs being put in there.
Now, one thing, when we did the interview, when I talked to you for the written article, we focused on new trucks. And one thing I didn't ask you was, maybe you got a guy who's stepping out on his own and he's bought a used truck. He's going to buy 2 or 3 used trucks. Is this TCO something that guy, that second life guy, maybe even a third life guy with a truck, can this still be a useful tool to help them eventually get to one day where they're going to buy brand new equipment?
Absolutely. So, I think about that from their perspective, and obviously they're accepting that they're not going to have optimal fuel economy, right? They're not going to be at the bottom end of their repair and maintenance curve. But what they're not
going to be able to always get the options they would if they were speccing from a dealer. Kind of take what you can get, right?
But there are a lot of people who that model fits perfect for them. And when you're thinking about that, it really can go away from just a replacement to understanding, a maintenance strategy of how to manage it. So if we know that if you're running TCO and you're buying trucks and they have 500,000 miles at them, and you're still watching your maintenance cost and you're watching your VMRS codes so that you understand when components are failing, you can get into a predictive space where you're at least limiting cost. If you know that transmissions go bad at 750,000 miles and you want to buy a truck at 500,000 miles, well, you don't go ahead and replace the transmission day one. What we do is probably schedule it in around 720,000 miles. And now you're not having a road event. You're not having breakdown, customers, missing deliveries, but you are still acknowledging that you're going to have to spend that money. And anytime you can plan a repair and say, how can I go ahead and get this addressed? You're going to be in better shape than breaking down and going to whatever repair facilities on the side of the road where you may not have preferential payment or treatment, right, on parts and pricing. If you can schedule it in with your local repair facility or even your local shop, if you may own your own shop, right? When you can do that, it makes all the sense in the world. And understanding where you compare versus new trucks is still important to make sure that the value of the used truck is still there for you.
So we always like to hold these around 20 minutes. So another question we didn't talk about in the written interview, which I think is always important. We'll kind of throw this out as we go out the door here. Are there common mistakes people make with TCO that can skew the numbers, lead you to bad decisions that you see? And you would just tell people watching this, hey, watch out for these.
Yeah. So the biggest challenge that we have is when people start averaging and averaging and averaging. Okay. You say, well, my 2017s are running at this, a cost per mile of 7 cents per mile on the repair and maintenance side, and we're getting this for an MPG. Okay, on average they are. But if you have a larger fleet that has hundreds of trucks within that band, you're going to have some trucks that are running at the lower end and some trucks that are running at the higher end. And really, the sweet spot is to get down to a truck level P&L and make sure that you can avoid, an average means some are running at 14 cents and some are running at 7 cents. When you're running 100,000 miles a year, that's a $7,000 a year difference. Get down to the individual level, understand how each individual piece of equipment is performing, and then use that data to help guide your next decisions, whether it's proactive repair and maintenance or replacement, whatever your strategy is. Knowing it from a asset level is probably the most important thing you can do.
Well, I'm going to throw one more at you, and it's kind of my kudos to you for taking your time to talk to me today. A guy's watching this, he's having trouble. What can Fleet Advantage do? What can you do to help him out?
Sure. So Fleet Advantage is an asset management company. We are a data-driven company. So the first thing we do with any client that we're working with is to take in their fuel and economy data, to take in all their repair and maintenance data. We can put it into our system Atlas, and Atlas will help us determine what the fleet strategy is for that company. So you get down to that truck level P&L, understand your current economics of your trucks, and then outline what the strategy is. We can help people finance and get into a new equipment. We can also help people, we sell 3,000 to 4,000 used trucks a year. So if it's used trucks is the correct avenue, we can help you out there. But regardless of where you want to go, leasing, used trucks, understanding your TCO of your current equipment is probably the most important thing you can do.
It's a tricky subject, but it's a fascinating one, and it's a useful tool. Final thoughts, anything you'd caution people or just give them something to think about on the way out the door?
Yeah, I think about, a new truck today costs somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000, depending on what kind of truck you're looking at. You would never go in and just randomly spend on another asset $7,000, $10,000, $15,000 a year and not track your costs. I know there's a lot of trucks and fleets. There's a lot of great systems out there. There's a lot of people that can help you. Understand it's an expensive way to go if you don't understand how your costs are going to roll into your equipment. So take the time, make sure you understand your TCO, get the true value out of your piece of equipment, regardless of what your next steps are, whether it's to keep it, replace it, or even go into used equipment.
Brian Antonellis, Fleet Advantage, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. I think a lot of people out there will get something out of this they can apply and really help them figure out where they are with the moving target that is TCO.
I appreciate it. It's a great subject to talk about.